Okay, perfect. Well, again, welcome to our Celebrating Cinco de Mayo with Cultural Competence. Looking forward to sharing everything that I've learned. I've learned a lot to put this information together. And, this is a journey. Cultural competence is a journey that never ends. I've chosen to dedicate my life fully to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And despite the fact that I learned more dedicatedly with books every day, my experiences and my interactions with you, with the community, with the organizations that I help, just continuously gives me something new to reflect on. So welcome, and now I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Can I get one thumbs up? Okay, excellent. So here we go. So before we get started, I'd like to honor the Maya. I am originally from Monterrey, Mexico, and they have this beautiful concept in Lak'ech, and it means I see myself in you. And I wanted to share that with you. This comes from a poem written by the Chicano playwright Luis Valdez. But the concept essentially talks about you are the other me. So I'm going to read it in Spanish and English for you, just to give you an opportunity to reflect. Tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. Si te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, me hago daño a mí mismo. I do harm to myself. Si te amo y respeto, if I love and respect myself, if I love and respect you, I think I got cross there. Me hago daño a mí mismo, I do harm to myself. Si te amo y respeto, if I love and respect you, me amo y respeto yo. I love and respect myself. So something to reflect as we get started on this journey. So cultural competence is what we are aiming to do as part of our learning about Cinco de Mayo. And it is such an essential skill for inclusion. The ultimate goal is to become more inclusive in our daily lives. And as you continue in your personal journey, I want you to keep these three things in mind. In this deeply human area, full with nuance, we are all learners. And although I do spend a little bit more time thinking about this subject, there's always another layer and another step leading to growth. The second thing to think about is about our personal responsibility. You own the impact that you have on those around you, even if sometimes your intention and your impact are not aligned. Your impact is really what matters. And the last part is that becoming more equitable and just and inclusive can go against a lot of our socialization. And so it will take some discomfort at many, many times, and it is a sign of your expanding growth. So let us continue. Cinco de Mayo. Okay, the history. And that is a picture of Puebla, where the Cinco de Mayo battle was fought. So tomorrow is the 160th anniversary of Cinco de Mayo. What is celebrated on the Cinco de Mayo is the Mexican victory over the French at the Battle of Puebla in 1862. Now, there was a poll in the US about how Americans plan to celebrate. The first one was to eat Mexican food. I plan to eat Mexican food too, but being Mexican, that might be what I do every day, except when my husband cooks, which he is French. So I eat Mexican or French food, or when our daughters cook, they are American, so we eat American food too. Drinking margaritas is number two. celebrating Mexican culture, which is what we're starting to do here, and you're going to be able to do even more deeply. Number 4 was drink Mexican beer. Modelo, I think, is my favorite if you are into the light, that not the only light beer, and then having a house party. And so as you think about all these different ways that you are going to celebrate, what I want to invite you is to think about what it is that you're celebrating. Number 1, you're celebrating the strength and the power and the resilience of the Mexican people to overcome invaders that were trying to take their land. And you can celebrate this about the Mexican people. You can celebrate this about the Ukrainian people. There are so many parallels that happened in the Battle of Puebla, and what is happening right now in Ukraine. But you can celebrate the resilience of people coming together. And then the second thing that happened with the Battle of Puebla is that the Mexican identity gelled and solidified. Before Cinco de Mayo, Mexico is still a country with a lot of diversity in the regions, the food, the language, the dress, the music, from the Pacific coast to northern Mexico to Yucatan. But what happened with the Battle of Puebla is that the Mexican identity unified as one. So think about that in terms of what you're celebrating that day. And now we're going to talk about a little bit of history. Now, I am not a history buff, so you're going to forgive me if you are a history buff and there is something that you would like to add to what I'm sharing today. But we get a lot of people thinking that Cinco de Mayo is Mexican independence. Well, Mexican independence actually happened 40 to 50 years before the Battle of Puebla. I put it in a range from 1810 to 1821 because really it took a lot of years, but we consider el 16 de septiembre as the beginning of that period of our Mexican independence. And it started with the Grito de Independencia. The Grito de Independencia was something that a priest, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, did. And essentially what he was calling for is the end of 300 years of rule by Spain and looking for the land to be redistributed and looking for racial equity, something very top of mind these days. And when people celebrate el 16 de septiembre from the 15th to the 16th, what they shout is, there's many versions, but this is my favorite: Viva la paz con justicia y libertad, viva México. And then bells will sound. And that means, may peace and justice with liberty live. And then, of course, viva México. And so after the start and the independence from Spain, many important things happened that led us to the Cinco de Mayo, Batalla de Puebla. In 1846, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico lost 55% of their land, sold it to the US. And that caused a lot of turmoil to start. You continued progressing through those 20 years of turmoil. And in 1861, Benito Juárez was elected, and he was the first indigenous president of Mexico. So he came to power and he looked at what was happening in Mexico, and he saw that 70% of all of our wealth was going to pay foreign debt. And so he said, hang on, we're going to stop this for a couple of years. And so France, England, and Spain were not happy about that. So what they did is in 1961-62, they came over to Mexico, at which point Mexico negotiated with Spain and England, and they left. Unfortunately, France had other ideas. They had the idea of actually conquering Mexico and making it a monarchy. And so that is when the Battle of Puebla occurred in 1862. And then the story continues. You'll hear about the monarch that was instituted by Napoleon III for a few years, but that happens later. So now let's talk a little bit about what did this look like. There's this map of Mexico, and you can see where the French flag is. That is Veracruz. That is where the French and the Spaniards and the English landed, but then two of them left. And you can see the path from Veracruz to Mexico City. Now, at that point, you can see where the Mexican flag is on the top of Mexico. And that is what is now Ciudad Juarez. So Benito Juarez had to move his government up to the north as France was moving forward with the invasion. And from there, the French thought that they could just go through really quickly from Veracruz through Puebla into Mexico City. And they did not expect themselves to be detained so quickly. And again, these ideas of what is happening with Russia and how they thought they could take Kyiv went. So following next came the battle that many people described as David versus Goliath in 1862. So France had sent 6,000 troops. They were very well prepared. They had, in those times, what was considered the best military in the world. And so Juarez from the north got together a group of 2,000 men. Many of them were indigenous, Mexican, or of mixed ancestry, and sent them to Puebla. In Puebla, this Texas-born, which used to be Mexico, general, which was Ignacio Zaragoza, he was born near Goliad in Texas, prepared for the French assault. And so what happened that day was, there was a lot of missteps, and also the desire of the 2,000 men to defend their country really had a really big effect in how, being outnumbered and being outgunned, by dusk they had won the battle. So at that point, the French retreated to Veracruz, went to Napoleon III and said, hey, you really need to send us some reinforcements. And then that contributed to what happened later. But before we move forward, I want to talk a little bit about the players. Benito Pablo Juarez Garcia, he was, like I mentioned, the first indigenous-born president of Mexico. His ancestry was Zapoteca. He was born in Oaxaca, and by the age of 3, he was orphaned, mom and dad. And then he went to live with his grandparents, and unfortunately, they passed away a few years later as well. So at that point, he went to be a shepherd in the cornfields. And when he was 12, he moved to where his sister was working as serving in a larger household, and started to learn Spanish. Spanish was not his native language, and he did not know how to speak it. A lot has been said about the incredible intelligence of Benito Juarez. He learned Spanish, he was noticed, he was brought into the seminary by a priest that got to know him. A few years later, he decided it was not for him. So he went on to law school. He became a judge, then he became the governor of Oaxaca, and then eventually the president of Mexico. An interesting fact is that Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, was named after Benito Juarez. And then also something that I found is interesting, because they noted everywhere that he is considered to be the shortest president that the world has had, at 137 meters. And that is just such a testament to the powerhouse that he had, and his drive, and his intelligence, and his strategy. Because I can imagine in those days, just like today, height is in many kinds of, in many ways a deciding factor in terms of the jobs that you might hold. As you probably know, in current day Fortune 500 companies, over 60% of all the CEOs are over 6 feet high, when in the population, I think it's less than 7%. So an interesting thing to think about. Now let's talk about Luis Napoleon Bonaparte III. He was the nephew of Napoleon. He was the only French politician that has been both a president and an emperor. When he was originally elected as president, he was elected with 70% of the male suffrage. But before he came to power in France, he lived in Italy for many years, and he was known for having a deep affection for women. And one of the funny stories that they say about him is that he became enamored with a lady that was already married, and he was obsessed with giving her flowers in person. I'm sure he thought that that would just swoon her over and make him leave her husband and go with him. And so he dressed as a woman to make his way and throw his flower at her feet, which didn't go too well for him. He was literally and physically thrown out of the place where they were. But then he went to France, and he did a lot of good things for France, especially for Paris. He destroyed 4,000 buildings in Paris because the conditions were really unsanitary, and he opened up the roads so that carriages and then cars could go through. But then he ended up going to England, dying there, and he is buried in England. Now, something about Luis Napoleon Bonaparte III is that he had greater ideas about the Americas, and he wanted to expand the colonies, the French colonies. And so that is why he had a big interest in Mexico, so he could have cheap raw material flowing into France. So what happened with Luis Napoleon Bonaparte III? I like to say that. And what were the implications to the Civil War? This was really, really fascinating. So he was very upset that he could not get cotton from the southern colonies in the US. There were blockades, naval blockades by the Union, preventing ships from going back and forth. And so he was a supporter of the Confederate Army. Now, he wanted a tit for tat. He wanted his cotton, and in exchange, he was going to give them weapons and munitions. When he lands in Veracruz, he, in his mind, is going to go straight through Veracruz, through to Puebla, to Mexico City, and then up to the north. Now, when they were sent back from the Battle of Puebla, they had a year-long delay. And this gave Abraham Lincoln's forces the ability to win enough battles so that by the time that Napoleon had actually come back and recaptured Mexico, it really didn't make any sense for the French to give support to the Confederate Army. And so by the time when they occupied Mexico City in 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg was about to start, and all the signs were pointing towards the Union winning. So this Cinco de Mayo is very much an American holiday as well. And the impact that Cinco de Mayo had on the Civil War in the US is theorized as being very large. So now let's talk a little bit about the celebration itself. So what are the Mexican roots, the Mexican American roots of the celebration? When the Battle of Puebla was happening, it was really in the midst of the Civil War. In 1862, nothing had been decided. Now, you remember how the 50% of the Mexican territory became American US territory. And so a lot of Mexicans obviously still lived. And Mexico had always been an incredible proponent to abolish slavery. One of the first laws enacted by Mexico when they gained their independence from Spain was to abolish slavery. So Mexican Americans saw the Cinco de Mayo triumph as a way to commemorate not only their acts of resistance during the US-Mexico War, but also as a way to continue to fight to hold their own after incorporation had happened. And so in California and Nevada, a lot of really interesting things started happening where as the rallying cry for Mexican Americans, they formed these entities called juntas patrióticas, meaning patriotic assemblies. Now, they gained so much steam. They had, by 1863, over 14,000 members in 123 different locations. And there were speeches hailing the general that had won the Cinco de Mayo, General Zaragoza, and denouncing the Confederacy. Now, they also put their money where their mouth was. There were dues as high as $100 a month that some members paid, and this money went to support the efforts both in the north, supporting the Union, the north of the Rio Grande, and in the south of the Rio Grande, supporting the Mexican army. And so celebrations for Cinco de Mayo have been going on nonstop since 1862 in Los Angeles. And again, that is something that is so interesting because as a Mexican, we didn't really celebrate Cinco de Mayo. And I think that in Puebla and close to the towns in Puebla, it is a little bit more of a celebration. But before I came to Austin when I was 21, I had never gone to a Cinco de Mayo party. And I can tell you that afterwards, I don't have enough fingers in my hands to count how many times and how many parties I've gone to celebrating Cinco de Mayo. And in complete humility and honesty, it wasn't until this week when I fully understood the depth of the importance of this celebration in its own right for the Mexican American population in the US. The government in the US has also recognized that. And in 1998, the White House or the US Postal Service created a stamp celebrating Cinco de Mayo. And ever since, it has been customarily observed in the White House as well. Now, a lot of people think about Cinco de Mayo and they scratch their heads and they see a lot of the commercialization. And so I wanted to share why and how did this get commercialized. If you do a quick search for Cinco de Drinko, you will find a lot of restaurants and parties and bars celebrating. I took away where this came from, but this is actually an advertisement for an event this year. And so Cinco de Drinko has been really associated with getting drunk, drinking tequila, drinking beer. And some of that came from the major corporations like Anheuser-Busch, Coors, and Miller, contributing millions and millions of dollars to advertise to the Hispanic market. In 2013, more beer was bought for Cinco de Mayo than there was for the Super Bowl or St. Patty's Day, which is just mind-blowing. I want to find a statistic of 2022 and what that looks like. But, you know, despite the commercialization for Mexican Americans, It's a very special day, and it holds significant meaning where people come together to celebrate their shared heritage. And these cultural appropriations, like you see here, the lady painting in the school, combining Dia de los Muertos, which is another very important cultural celebration for Mexican and Mexican Americans and many Latinos as well across the rest of Latin America, are brought together. So there is a lot of cause for concern on this cultural appropriation. And so I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about cultural appropriation and cultural competence and how you can do each. Because what we're advocating here is not that you don't celebrate, but that you celebrate in a mindful way. And so, cultural competence, what is it? Well, what is it not? Cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is really the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of customs, practices, beliefs of another cultural group, typically by members of a cultural group that tends to be the more dominant in society. And it is done in a way that reinforces harmful stereotypes that contribute to oppression. So we talked in our previous webinar about Dia de los Muertos, how Disney tried to trademark Dia de los Muertos. You can imagine they were doing this in anticipation of the release of Coco. How they thought that could be in any way respectful or appropriate, I really don't know. Because trying to trademark a cultural holiday in order to sell products, it really hurts the true meaning and intention of the holiday. Now, we have a couple of images there of people dressed in ponchos with fake guns, with some, like they call them in English, sombreros, or in Spanish, sombreros. And I want to talk a little bit about dressing up, because it is hard sometimes for people to understand what is acceptable and what is not acceptable when you're dressing up. So giving you an example, when people in Halloween dress as a trans person, and you have a scruffy man with a hairy chest showing it, they're really sharing the incorrect message that transgender women are actually men in dresses, and transgender women are women. And when a trans woman steps out into the world, they're being their authentic self. They are not wearing a costume. So it's important to think about, when we dress with these stereotypes, what are we really saying, and how is it affecting that group that we are dressing as? The same goes dressing as Native American. Even if you're dressing in a historically accurate way, it trivializes the Native American genocide, and it continues to perpetuate harmful stereotypes that fueled it. You have dressing as a geisha, dressing as a gypsy. So at any given point, I think the message is that it is never acceptable to dress as somebody else's culture, because it can have a variety of unintended impact. Now we get to cultural competence. So what is cultural competency? Cultural competency is a set of behaviors, attitudes, and policies that allow us to work effectively and interact effectively across cultures in a way that acknowledges and respects our culture and the culture of another person, both. I focus on the word competence here because competence means having the capacity to function effectively as an individual and an organization. When you add the cultural aspect, it's within the context of different people's cultural beliefs and behaviors. Now, it requires cultural awareness and sensitivity, skills, knowledge, and intention. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about what culturally competent leaders pay attention to. They pay attention to different beliefs and how different cultures and backgrounds see the world and what their place is in it. They pay attention to different communication styles. How do people convey information and feedback? Is it directly, indirectly? And a lot of these things are based on the culture. Different regards to formality, the different approach to hierarchy within the social and professional structure. Is it horizontal? Is it vertical? Is it different from their own hierarchical understanding, needs, and preferences? They pay attention to different perceptions of time. Time in my culture, the Mexican culture, is very fluid. And time in some of my friends' German culture is very upfront. And also in the US, I think, when we hold a party in Mexico, we say, get there at 8. But as a host, you understand that people will probably show up at 8:30, 8:45, maybe 9. Whereas I had to get used to that idea of time, where if I say in the US, the party is at 8, I might actually have some friends showing up at 10 till 8. So I've adapted to make sure that I'm not ready and they don't catch me still in the shower. So the different perception of time is really critical to understand for a culturally competent leader. And also just essentially the uniqueness and individuality, knowing that, yes, there's cultures, there's groups, there are common habits that a group might be part of, but you should also always perceive people as individuals. And all of this will pay up with the business case, which is developing trustworthy relationships, having the best people in your organization and keeping them as part of your organization, giving the best that they have to give, and really creating psychologically safe spaces that will enhance the efficiency and productivity. So a few practical tips. What to do to celebrate Cinco de Mayo in a culturally competent way and navigate that thin line between the cultural appreciation and the cultural appropriation. Well, the first thing is invite Mexican American colleagues or friends to describe how they celebrate and what it means to them. The second is visiting the festival and museums that can educate you and your children. It's so powerful to give your children the gift of knowledge and context. And do celebrate and savor Latin cuisine. I'm going to share a little bit of Latin cuisine here at the end of our conversation. Now, things that you definitely should not do. Don't organize a company event that is only focused on that external representation, right? Where you might only hang papel picado and have sombreros and little ponchos around and tequila and maybe mezcal. Bring in the cultural aspect, bring in the education aspect. And as part of that, outside of an organization, but if you're going to a Cinco de Mayo celebration, don't wear a sombrero. Don't put on a face mustache that you think looks Mexican or wear a poncho. All of these things have been used so many times in cultural stereotypes of the lazy Mexican, the immigrant that doesn't have papers in the US, the lack of appreciation for the incredible talent that Latinos, Hispanics, Mexican Americans, Mexicans have and only seeing them as part of the service industry. So all of these harmful stereotypes get put together in this really hard to disentangle meaning when you just put on a sombrero. And very likely you don't have any harmful intentions, but that is the impact that you might have. And then the last thing that I want to see here is be mindful. Examine your intentions. If you do end up trying to recreate a celebration that is not your own, and I'm going to extend this to any celebration, think about your intentions. Why are you doing this? And so as we expand it to celebrating other diverse holidays respectfully, the first thing to do is to own your own learning. How do you pronounce the celebration? What is the name? What is the meaning and the origin? What does an authentic celebration look like? The second part is to invite others to give you their perspective and reframe your why. And this comes with just a very polite and gentle request to say, I am interested about your fill in the blank tradition. And I would like to learn more about it from you and from your heritage. Would you be willing? Right? A lot of times we expect that because we have our Jewish friend, they're going to be able to educate us, or they should educate us on the Sabbath and their traditions. Or we have a Muslim friend. What does Ramadan stand for? And all of these things might be true, but you've got to ask. It is not a given that they're there to educate you. And then if they do take the time to share their experiences and their set capital S selves, thank them for their time and their effort. And then be mindful in your choices again. Is there something that you want to adopt? When we talk about Dia de los Muertos, such a beautiful celebration of remembrance of people that are no longer here. So if you do want to use the celebration as a way to incorporate it into your own family traditions, just think about it. Is it okay? What am I adopting? And am I understanding it? And ask some people that are part of that culture. That will really give you a well-rounded framework to understand what you're doing and whether it is the right thing for you and your family to do. Okay, so we talked about food, and I want to share with you about mole. Mole, if you want to go and celebrate tomorrow, go and order mole poblano. Mole poblano, there are many, many kinds of mole. There is green mole made with pumpkin seeds. There is pink mole, which I actually don't know what gives it the color. There is yellow mole, but the mole poblano is mole from Puebla, from where the Cinco de Mayo battle happened. And it is a very thick sauce, typically not very spicy, but then again, my taste buds are a little different than most. And it includes cocoa and 20 different kinds of other ingredients, and many different kinds of spices and chiles. And it is typically eaten with many kinds of meat. Now, chicken tends to be a favorite. There's a restaurant in Austin that I like that does the duck mole enchilada. But the lore of where the mole poblano came from is that the 6th century nuns received an unexpected visitor in the form of a bishop. And they had nothing to give him except an old turkey in the yard. And so they decided to put together any and everything that they had in their cupboard. And they simmered it until it became really thick. And to their delight, apparently the archbishop was very delighted. And so now we have mole poblano. there are a few places in Austin, if you are calling from Austin, Texas, that have an incredible um, amount of traditional mole. So now the second one that I want to share with you is rompope. So as you know, in Mexico, the children drinking alcohol with the family is not unheard of. And in my family, like many others, in family reunions, I had sangria, which is delicious red wine with fruits and juices. But as dessert, we had rompope. And rompope, many people call it the Mexican eggnog. Rompope was originally made by the nuns of Santa Clara. And if you see this bottle, it is still the most common and most delicious kind of rompope. So they sell it in specs. I also invite you to go and purchase a bottle of rompope. It is alcoholic. It is very sweet, and it is very delicious. I wouldn't advise necessarily giving it to your kids, unless you feel so inclined. And then the last thing that I wanted to share with you, again, if you're going to celebrate tomorrow, Cinco de Mayo, think about these three things that are so ingrained in Mexican culture. The first one is tamarind. And I know that the Indian culture also uses tamarind a lot, but we Mexicans are obsessed with our tamarind. And you can get agua fresca, which is tamarind with sugar and water. You can get it in almost any restaurant that has agua fresca. Horchata also is another good rice-based drink. And then tajin. You will see us put tajin in a lot of things. Most of you know it by having it on the rim of a margarita. I put it on oranges, pineapple, mango, delicious. And then the last thing is chamoy. Chamoy is actually made with ciruelas, I believe. It is tangy, and most kids use it as part of their candy instead of grabbing a Hershey's bar. There's chamoy in all sorts of different presentations. And when you mix chamoy and tamarind, oof, in heaven. So with this, we are going to open up for any questions that you might have. I want to thank you on behalf of the Inclusion Plus Institute. I'm the CEO and founder of it. And you can see in my background, I chose to keep my nonprofit background, Zoom background up. It's the Strong Latina Project. We are looking to elevate the voices of strong Latinas through storytelling and give tools through the creation of a Strong Latina playbook. So if you're interested in the Strong Latina Project, please visit us at the Facebook page. But now we're going to open it up to some questions. Anybody have any questions? Okay, one question that just came up is, when did Cinco de Mayo become such a big celebration in the US? Well, based on my research, it became a big celebration el Cinco de Mayo of 1862. But I think that there was a resurgence with the Chicano and Chicana movement in the 50s and 60s, where it has become an icon of celebrating the Mexican-American heritage. And of course, then it just got more popular with the commercialization. But now we have an opportunity to go back and actually celebrate all the important things. Okay, another question is, will we receive a copy of the slides? Yes. As a thank you for attending our conversation today, you're going to receive a copy of the slides and also a cheat sheet for how to celebrate holidays in a culturally inclusive way. See any other questions? How is Cinco de Mayo celebrated in Mexico? Well, in Mexico, the 15 de septiembre and 16 de septiembre are the main celebration where people get the day off. We call it puente. When you have the celebration on a Tuesday, you get Monday off. So you create a bridge. That's what puente means. So you have it on a Thursday, you get Friday off. But in Mexico, Cinco de Mayo is not very often celebrated with friends or with any other dedicated parties. I believe that with the commercialization, it will continue to get more popular in Mexico as well. Just as Halloween has spread, I think that the restaurant and alcohol celebration aspect of Cinco de Mayo might make Mexico start celebrating it a little bit more, but it really hasn't been. Let's see. How can I ask my family and friends to celebrate this day respectfully? Well, when you get these slides, how about you walk them through them and talk about some of the things that surprised you? Reflect about that. What are those things that actually reflected you or surprised you? And then have a discussion over dinner or Zoom or however it is that you meet with your friends and family. Another question is, I'd love to know more about how this is American holiday as it's connected to abolishing slavery. What are some ways to highlight this link together? Well, we alluded a little bit to this, where because of Cinco de Mayo, the French were not able to help the Confederacy, and also because Mexican and Mexican Americans that were in what used to be Mexico had this deeply ingrained feeling of being against slavery. Mexico had always been a bit against slavery. And so I think that is a good way to highlighting the connection between the people that stayed in their home, but the border crossed them. And so it connected a lot of the Mexican American and the intent of the Union to fight the Confederacy and abolish slavery. Is there any other questions? Well, I would like to share our email address, and you can contact hello@vectoru.global if you have any other questions. And I think I will close with the last question that I received, which is, what does Cinco de Mayo mean to me? Well, I came to the US when I was 21. I left Mexico because of domestic violence. And so I crossed the border. I brought with me a lot of different celebrations and preferences and cuisine and culture and habit. And now over the last 28 years, I have brought all of this to my new country in the US. I became an American citizen a few years ago. And so for me, Cinco de Mayo really means this integration in identity, and the connection that we have as people, where I don't know, an immigrant and a foreigner doesn't have to be, where the border is and where you belong to, but we all have a connection. And if you saw in the presentation today, the fact that, you know, France had an influence in the Confederacy, and then the Union um, helped actually expel France in the end from Mexico. And so there's like so many interconnectedness. And for me, it's another example of the fact that we are more alike than we are different. So with that, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank you for your time. I deeply appreciate you participating and raising your cultural competence and allowing me to raise mine by preparing for this. Um, and if you have any needs for diversity, equity, and inclusion, um, consulting in your organizations, please don't hesitate to contact us. We do a lot around not only cultural competency, but unconscious bias, power and privilege, being an ally, all of these very important subjects. Would be happy to come and do that with your organization as well. So thank you and have a wonderful Tuesday and go celebrate tomorrow. I will definitely have a margarita. Bye.